So, hi everybody. I'm really pleased to welcome you at the second online WordPress Pivo edition, which will be held in English. And for today's program, we have really great talks of our friends and collaborators who couldn't join us for WordCamp Prague, since we had talks only in English, in Czech and Slovak, and it would be really pity to miss them out. So what's on our list? First, we'll check what's new in the world of WP. Then we go on a podcasting with Richard Midson, and then we'll follow up with static WordPress, and we'll learn how to make WordPress faster and more secure with Maciek Palmowski. Then, if everything goes well, you could click on a sessions in the left corner and join us at the virtual table rooms where we can just chat a bit, so we could feel more like being in a restaurant instead of online event, because I think everybody missed that, as I do. Actually, yeah, great. So let's jump right into the what's new in WordPress. And I will share with you two links. One is the Czech version, which is written as article, and then there are Google Slides, which you can follow up. Oh, does it work? Yeah, which you can follow up with me and click through the links and bookmark whatever you find interesting. So what has happened in the WordPress for the last 2 months? So first, changes in WordPress. As you've probably noticed, we've started with release WordPress 5.7 in the beginning of March. Here is a great overview, which is really overwhelming, written in Kinsta as always. I really like it there. So what has changed? There are blog editor improvements like buttons, social icons, font size settings for listing and code blocks. Other things which you could be interested in is reset password feature. So if you're an administrator, you go to the users, you could send reset password email to someone else, which is kind of like good and bad feature because it could be insecure. Then there is a migration tool which helps you to move from HTTP to HTTPS. I mean, it's better later than never, but I think most of the sites will be HTTPS already. Other things which they have touched are UI improvements, like login and registration page got really redesigned, so the buttons are more clear, and they try to guide user not to forget to copy the password before you click save, because I mean, it happened to me many times and I'm probably not alone. And then there is a color palette change which got unified, so the variety of colors used on the WordPress, it's more or less regular, so it would please you. Developers will enjoy native lazy loading, which is really cool, and now it works not only on images, but it does on iframes as well. But here's a huge reminder, because not all iframes which are embedded into WordPress itself have a height and width attribute. So you need to double check that the lazy loading actually works for you and the size is not bumping up and down. So there are more things. I really liked filters for block types. So you can type render _block _ the block name and filter just for the rendering that block, which is really cool. There are improved robots API, so you can manipulate what's printed in robots.txt. And finally, few filters for scripting and enqueuing scripts, which means that you could support the async parameter or pass nonces. So there is a really big discussion about major releases in 2021, since everybody thinks it's impossible to have 4 major releases from 2 reasons. 5.8 is probably getting delayed and maybe without FC editor. So we'll jump right in after this slide. And the second is that the community is a bit tired. And if we want to keep that pace, we would really need to push all the contributors to be streamlined with the huge releases without any space to take a break, which is really needed in this online time. So there is a really good summary from Sarah Gooding, and I really advise you to read about it. So WordPress 5.8 and full site editing is really a huge topic right now. You can click through the link on GitHub and see what's really needed to be a part of the WordPress 5.8. And as you could see, there are really a lot of things to do. There is one to go, and that's 2021 as full site editing only. I mean, you should be able to do 2021 theme just within the full site editor. And there's going to be an attempt by Karolína Vyskočilová, which is she's behind the WordPress theme squad, and you can watch it online. I think it's next Tuesday. So check it out and we'll see what happens. And there are many resources you can follow up and be up to date. The first one is Full Site Editing, the Ultimate Resource List, made by Birgit Pauli-Haag, which is really endless. Huge amount of links currently updated and created. So if you need to know something, go there. Links to the polemics about WordPress in 5.8. And yeah, more of that. And basically, if full site editing will be part of 5.8, it will be decided during April. Otherwise, they will be moved to 5.9. What's going to be in WordPress 5.82, it's gallery block update. Basically, that would mean that you have gallery block, which is currently just a blog of images, but in the 5.8, it should be blog of image blogs. So there is a call for testing and good detailed about what it could bring to you when you have galleries as images separately, and what are pros and cons by Justin Tadlock. Definitely recommended. So let's jump for events. As many of you know, there was a WordCamp Prague in the end of the February. Unfortunately, it was just in Czech, but for those of you who speak Czech, the talks are already on YouTube, and you can grab and watch what you haven't done yet. The main leads organizer's thoughts on how to make a conference experience online, which is really huge and amazing article written in English, so everybody can read it. And it's about how we made this conference and what we need to solve. And then finally, there is WordCamp Europe coming from Monday to Thursday in June. So I hope that everybody there will be present and we can meet up. I'm really looking forward what they will bring with the new format, because I mean, personally, I can imagine being on online conference for 4 days during the working hours. So maybe they will split it to smaller parts so we can watch at the evening and not be tired of an online event. So let's check it out. The schedule is not yet published. Call for speakers, organizers, sponsors, not not anything. So if you're interested in, just have an eye on it. So now just a few quick tips and remarks, because I'm reading newsletters as probably you do. So what was interesting for me? In February, WordPress passed 40% market share. So that means that 40% of web pages run on WordPress, which is really amazing. And yeah, so you know that you're working with living organism. So huge things for me as a developer. There is a proposal of dropping support of EA 11, which is great. That would, I mean, just imagine your code base if you drop Internet Explorer 11 support. They say that just for Gutenberg, it will save 40% of size of all files. Great. So to happen, the WordPress on 11 on Internet Explorer should be used at maximum 1%, but the target is almost there, so we could celebrate soon. I hope so. There is two things. As you know, from the 1st of March of May, there will be Core Web Vitals, which you should meet and get boosted with a ranking on Google. But there is a really good article where it says that you need to pass all the Core Web Vitals to get boosted. And if not, it won't affect you that much. To help you out, I found out a really great article on font loading strategies on CSS tricks. So if you want to boost up your speed with fonts, just go there and check it out. And there are plugins recommendations. Currently, there is a new plugin which is called Flying Pages. And basically what it does, it enables you with preloading. I mean, just imagine that you visit a WordPress site, you are strolling around, reading, and sometimes you hover with your mouse over the link. And what this plugin does, it preloads the resources which are on that page. So when you finally click, you get it almost instantly. It needs some tweaking with some caching plugins like WP Super Cache, but otherwise it works pretty almost out of the box. What I want to say, this plugin is for free and it's on WordPress.org, but I've spotted that some premium plugins do include this feature as well, like WP Rocket. So maybe if you use that one, you could check it there. And another one which was interesting for me is from Automattic, and they released NewsPack newsletters, which allows you basically compose emails in Gutenberg and then send them with MailChimp and other services. So that could save you some time. Unfortunately, there were many issues and vulnerabilities. It's hard to pick the one which were most interesting or most severe, but we did a short list for you. So if you have any of these plugins or themes, which I will present in a short minute, you should double check that you have updated to the very last version. So first, there was a vulnerability in Thrive themes and their plugin as well. There was XCSS in Elementor and really bad critical zero-day vulnerability in the plugin for Elementor. I know that both of these plugins are very used, so just double check that you've updated. Several bugs in Ninja Forms and Next-Gen Gallery, and a couple of user-related issues. Basically, in all of these cases, some kind of users could act as an administrator and bypass the security setting. Body press, responsive menu, very used tutor LMS, which is used for webinars and so on. I mean, imagine that your students could go to admin and do some actions. there was a vulnerability in Automatic's plugin, but that was kind of minor because you need to be logged in as administrator. However, you could send your malicious code via the settings form. And the very last, PHP's Git server got hacked. So they inserted a backdoor into source code with a typo fix commit. It got merged, but they fixed it pretty quickly. But I mean, you can be unlucky in many ways. So that's it. And for my quick tips from WordPress, so let's check if there is our another speaker. Rick, are you here? Could you join me, please?
Well, a very good evening to you, and thank you for inviting me along to this talk tonight. I am sending you a message. Feels like I'm sending you a message from the future or something, but for some reason the talk part of this obviously didn't work tonight, so I'm doing this as a pre-recorded thing, but hopefully I can join you live once I've done this, and you can ask me any questions you like, because this topic is something that I am really passionate about. And thank you also for inviting me to be part of WP Pivo as well. You know, it's a long time since I've been to the Czech Republic, and sadly due to COVID I can't do it now, but last time I was there I was talking to aircraft manufacturers. The Czech Republic is so good at making these small planes, like microlights and stuff like that, and I was involved in that at the time. But anyway, something completely different tonight. Let's talk about that instead. I don't know how much you personally know about the podcasting world. You know, maybe you've never listened to one, or maybe you're an avid listener, but podcasting, there's only one word really to define it, and it's big. You know, okay, well, not as big as blogging, but when it comes to democratizing publishing, podcasting is a niche, but it is a big niche. There are now thought to be 1.5 million podcasts out there, and it is growing fast. And even if you ignore those that have stopped creating new content, there's inevitably some people will, there are still something like 500,000 shows with 34 million episodes. 51% of all US homes are now thought to be podcast listeners. In emerging markets like India, there are an estimated 40 million podcast listeners so far, and it is growing fast. All fueled there by better download speeds and increasing availability of mobile phones and better data rates. And when I co-hosted a live webinar on podcasting at WordPress.com, we had more than 600 people watching live. We were truly outstanded by it, but there is that much interest in podcasting. And it's not really that much of a surprise when you think about human nature. You know, podcasting has followed a similar path to blogging. People want to create, we know that. Some people want to write, some people want to talk, many people want to do both. And I personally can relate to this, I'm sure you can too. You know, I'm a WordPress.com happiness engineer now, but I used to be a radio news editor for the second largest news organisation in the UK. But I personally knew fairly early on that I was an audio person rather than a writer or a blogger. This is a sign that hung outside the newsroom where I first started. In fact, still hanging outside there right now in an area of London here in the UK called Wandsworth. And you basically had this tatty couple of rooms above a shop. This is a Google Street View of how it looks right now. It's not exactly an impressive area, it still looks just like that. It was a typical newsroom though. You know, there were papers everywhere, journalists never seemed to have time to tidy up, cables everywhere. And in one room was the editor with the best computer. He had the desktop publishing computer that we were all excited about. I think it was a really old Mac. I'm pretty sure it was this one, which I'm sure one of you knows better, but I think it's a Macintosh 2, am I right? But he was the only one who had that machine. We all wrote our articles on very basic computers, so I'd start investigating this or that story, putting all my notes together, writing all the key points, and then I'd hand it over to the editor. Normally he would then have a look of shock on his face as he read what I'd written. And while he liked what I wrote, he would then have to spend a while correcting all my spelling and grammatical errors. There was a sort of spell check at the time, but you had to get really close to the word. And as for grammar, well, there was no Grammarly then. So it was no real surprise that for me personally, I ended up in radio news instead. The point is that people are different. You know, we have different ways of expressing ourselves, and that same urge that drives some of us to write pushes some of us to podcast. Of course, it's pretty obvious why WordPress started with a written word. You don't have to be, well, you don't exactly have to be a data scientist to work out that at the beginning the internet, for the public in particular, wasn't fast and it wasn't cheap enough to do much else. But as that changed, people started to inevitably find new ways to express themselves, first with audio and then with video. But this also led to a sort of staggered growth. As most website server companies didn't provide enough bandwidth for podcasts, dedicated podcast hosts started to appear. And then the same as well, as we know, happened with video. And the result is we sort of ended up with a situation whereby if you want to make video, you go to YouTube. If you want to make a podcast, you appear on iTunes or Spotify. If you want to write, you go to WordPress. The implication is that WordPress is really just for written content, which makes me really mad because people who think this, in my view, are completely missing the point of WordPress. And this is what I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about why podcasting and WordPress, to me, make such natural partners. I want to talk about why podcasters might be missing one of the most important parts of their process that can be solved with WordPress. But you know what I most want to do? I want to try and give you some of the arguments that you can use next time you bump into a podcaster who is missing the point. Now, I have learned a lot about podcasters over the past year. 12 months ago, I started studying them because despite my background in radio, I didn't seem to have much luck with making a podcast myself. So I started researching them, talking to them and documenting what I found in a podcast myself. And in my show, I tested their ideas and I saw when people reacted and when they didn't. And it taught me a lot about the world of podcasting. And that is what I want to use to frame what I'm going to talk about tonight. Because I think WordPress offers a huge opportunity to podcasters, and podcasters offer a huge opportunity to the WordPress community as a whole. Okay, so let's imagine we have our imaginary podcaster. It could be Helen, it could be Hagatha, it could be Brian, it could be Phil. This is the person that we're going to try and persuade tonight, and for the sake of any better name, let's call him Phil tonight. So what's he going to say to us? Well, perhaps the first question will be, how do I set up a podcast on WordPress? Well, let's have a look. Step one, you need to record something. Now, you could get out your microphone and plug it into your laptop and record your voice. And if you want to come across as an expert, as a single authority, maybe that's exactly what you want to do. Another popular way of doing it now is to have a Zoom conversation and record it. That generates a file, but as most podcast platforms need an MP3 file, you need to convert it. But there are plenty of free converters like this one online that I just used in this demo here. So once we convert it, I need to get it online. So I've dragged it into my media folder there on my WordPress site. It's no different to any other file that we want people to see. It needs to be on a server connected to the internet. We all know this stuff. So I drag it into my media folder there on WordPress. Now you could upload it to the server that hosts your website like I've just done there. And certainly when you start, this is the cheapest and easiest way of doing it. As you grow though, you might want to consider a dedicated podcast host like Libsyn or Blueberry or Anchor FM, or a website host that operates in the cloud with a distributed service. And this is what you'll need to explain to Phil about why. Because if he releases his podcast on Monday at 9 a.m. and 3,000 people's podcast apps download it to their device, his website server host may not be too happy, despite that marketing claim they made when he bought the hosting plan about unlimited bandwidth. But also, podcasts are changing, and some services don't even download a podcast in advance anymore, but stream it. Google Podcasts do that. And if Phil is fighting for bandwidth with others because he got a really cheap VPS for his website, his listeners might find the podcast refuses to play or stutters, and his listeners all give up. And with a lot of people listening at 1.5 or even double the speed to podcasts now, that's more draw on the server too. I listen to most podcasts at about 1.5 speed because you can get through it faster and you can still take it all in. But let's not scare Phil at the start. He can certainly start on his VPS or frankly anywhere when he only has a few listeners. So we've got his episode file online here. So how do we get that file playing on Google Podcasts and iTunes and Spotify, etc.? Well, we do that with an RSS feed. Now, if you've managed to avoid playing with blog RSS feeds, then let me give you a quick start on this. They are basically very simple text files that contain all the info and links to your show. Here's an example of one right now. I said simple actually, but you can see all the links to images like the title there, the show description, all these key details in here. Now, somehow we need to generate this file, because we don't want to be writing this stuff, do we? So how do we do that? Well, of course, WordPress is already a great platform for building feeds like this. A post really is just a collection of information, isn't it? That can be interpreted however you like, just like with a theme interpreting post data. Now, with a WordPress post, we can write a blog or we can write our show notes. It doesn't really make a lot of difference. And with a featured image, we can add art to a blog post, but we can also add art to our podcast episode, like you can see me doing here on one of my episodes. I'm burning money. This was when I was trying to do some advertising for my podcast, and it kind of summed it all up. So we've got almost everything apart from the audio file in there. And while WordPress will natively produce a blog feed, it won't produce a good podcast one. So we need some help here. At WordPress.com, where I work, I can use the inbuilt system, but we'll look at both ways of doing this here. I create a category that I'll use to define my posts that will be making up my show episodes. I then define my show art and description and all the details about the show as a whole. Then I go and create a post which is going to contain this particular episode's details. So if I go to the post section there and I fill in my details like this, then I add an audio block with my media file in there, and finally I assign the post to the podcasting category so that it gets added to my RSS feed. And you can see it there, and if I refresh it, you can see it's added all the details in there for me. Now, if I want to do this on any WordPress installation, then I can simply use a plugin. There are a few out there. They all have fairly similar features, but let's have a look at PowerPress, because I think PowerPress do it really well and have made it easy, which is one of the things I think the podcaster Phil is going to want us to do, to make things easy. So with PowerPress, I install it first and activate it just like any other plugin, of course. Then I go through to the plugin settings, and then I follow through the wizard. And I'm doing the same thing as I did before, telling it which category to use, which podcast art I want to use for my show art as a whole. And then once I get to the end, I create a post again. Now, plugins like this want you to use their hosting service, of course, because they're made by hosting companies. So I could select media from them, but in this case, I'm starting out. And so I'm going to use the file again from my media folder. I grab the URL from there, just there, like that. And then I go back to the PowerPress settings, paste it in, verify it, and that then adds in all the details from that file that PowerPress needs into the RSS feed, which creates that text file again. So that's two ways of doing it. So there we go. We've entered all the details we need. Our RSS feed has been generated. All we do now on PowerPress is to head into the plugin settings to get the URL link to that feed. Now, one thing Phil might ask us is if he can move to a dedicated podcast host later on when he's got his 3,000 followers and listeners. And the answer is very much yes. Most of these platforms and plugin makers include some sort of importer to draw all your media files into their system. It also works the other way. You can use an RSS feed created on a podcast host to create posts in your website. We have a native tool to import podcasters from Anchor FM now. There's a link in Anchor FM on episodes to do this too. You can also do the same on PowerPress. So if I go to Anchor FM for this particular podcast, I grab the RSS feed there, and then I go back to the importer in PowerPress, and you will see when I enter the RSS feed, click go, it reads the RSS feed, and it creates posts for all these episodes. But this time the audio is being hosted on Anchor FM. So we've got, you can see the details in there. So we've got all our show details and episode details entered into WordPress. The RSS feed has been generated, and we have the URL that links to that file. So now, how do we get that feed to iTunes or Spotify or one of the many other platforms out there or podcast apps? Well, each platform has a slightly different way of doing it, but it's very simple. If we look at Spotify, for example, I log into the podcasters area like this. I add in, once it gets to it, the URL of my RSS feed, and then it reads that RSS feed, checks that everything looks good in there, and if you've given everything correctly, then it will accept it. And you can see I've got some very simple artwork for my podcast there. And it's rejected it here actually because I was using a test email to set this one up. But if I'd done it correctly, if I put in the details correctly, that would have verified. Now, some platforms are pretty quick. Once you've entered that, it's almost there instantaneously. Others like iTunes can take up to a week to approve your podcast the first time to get it on there. But once it's approved though, I can then go to my podcast app, search for my podcast by name. The app then searches its directory or any other directory that it accesses for the name of that podcast. and looks for the RSS feed link, and then it reads that file and uses the links in the feed to fill in the display. And you end up with something pretty like this with all these different podcast episodes. And when I click play, all it really does is looks for the URL mentioned in the enclosure tag in our RSS feed and plays that link. So it is a direct link to a file on the server. The app itself doesn't really do a lot beyond gathering links in the RSS feed and displaying what it finds in a pretty way. And that's basically it for setting up a podcast. So we have set Phil's podcast up, and he is happy, of course, but then Phil comes back to us and he says, I don't need WordPress. And you know what? He's absolutely right. He doesn't need it at all. He could go to a platform like Anchor FM or Blueberry or many of the others, and these platforms will automatically generate an RSS feed from the show details that he enters into that platform. And some even distribute it to iTunes and Spotify and all the other major platforms automatically for him. In other words, he can literally drop that step where he has to go to each platform to provide the URL to the RSS feed manually. He can drop it entirely. In fact, many of the new wave of podcasters are doing exactly this. They are bypassing a website altogether as they don't need it to generate the RSS feed. So what are you going to say to these people about WordPress? Well, let's talk about this, because this is the next big point I really want to get across tonight. And these are the people who I think we really have got the biggest opportunity with. Why are most podcasters doing what they do? Yeah, okay, some of them are doing it for fun, and good luck to them. Great, wonderful. But as I found in my research, most of them are actually doing it for a reason, even if they're not really aware of that reason. Maybe they ultimately want to promote their business, their brand, change attitudes to something, launch a campaign, sell products, whatever it is. Many have heard the message, you need a podcast for your business, but a lot haven't really thought about why or how to use it for that. Picture it this way. Let's say I'm running a public speaking training business and I want to promote my brand through my podcast. If I'm actually giving a talk to a conference for public speakers about this in 2 weeks' time, talking about this. So I'm recording my episode and I get to the end of the show and I realize that my audience now are going to be really fired up and wanting to take some action, maybe buy a product or sign up to my email list or sign up to my course. So remembering I don't have a website, what do I say? Something like, well, thanks for listening. How am I going to get people's email address if I don't have a website? A listener can follow my show on an app, but I can't get the email from an app. Let's say I have a podcast about an environmental campaign, and my aim once I find people up in the podcast is to get them to use a template I've created to get them to write to their local politician. So I get to the end of my show, and where am I going to send them? There's no option on an app. Maybe we could share this on Facebook, but we all know how things can vanish into Facebook and no one can ever find it again, even if you follow someone directly or a group. What if I'm running a podcast to promote my interior decorating business and I want to sell accessories? There's no shop. How do I build up my SEO for my podcast? How do I offer premium content, articles, checklists, spreadsheets? It goes on. You've gained all this attention, but you can't do anything with it. This is where WordPress totally transforms a podcaster's results, in my view. Because it's with WordPress, with a WordPress website, that they can turn this attention into action. And frankly, this goes beyond just a pre-recorded podcast. You know, you might be getting people's attention on Clubhouse, but you still need somewhere that you can send people. So with these arguments, we've convinced Phil that he needs a website now. He sees the opportunity, we hope. So he gets up his contact form after what we've said, and he hopes for the best. Because we know a contact form with no clear direction is never going to work. People don't just randomly fill out a contact form on the off chance that you might send them something of value, or maybe bots do, but not the kind of people that you want to reach. Now, when people listen to a podcast, the best way to turn that attention into action is by giving them something clear to do. This is basic internet marketing, as I think we all know. You know, for example, here's one way of doing it. You can see the sign-up form on this one. You fill in your details and you get a free video for your piano lesson. Here's another one with a simple question and an analyze your website button. Where is it? About there. With that button. And this is the only website that has ever got my email address. I never give mine away. It was set up by a public speaker called Grant Baldwin using Typeform, which I'll talk about in a second. And you can see it asks some questions and tells you how much you could earn as a public speaker. You just give your email address and join the mailing list, of course. And what did it say? $3,500. Yeah, like anyone would ever pay me that. But you get the point. It's hard not to be curious and give your email address to find out something that you are genuinely curious about. And of course, you can add all these different features into your WordPress website with a plugin. So let's have a quick look at some of these. There are quite a few out there. But to be honest, some of them are, well, a lot of them are actually quite expensive if you're just starting out. You don't have to Google that far to find quite a few charging anything from about $80 at the cheap end to about $520 per year, I found. Opt-in Monster is well known. Very feature rich as well at $168 per year on their cheapest plan. WP Forms at the lower end is $80, their normal price per year. Grant Baldwin, as I say, use Typeform, which is on their cheapest plan, just under $350 per year. Great if this is a business and our podcaster Phil is already making a bit of money, but what if he wants to start off on the cheap? Or for something simpler, you could use something as simple as a contact form, but this time with a clear direction. You know, sign up here to get my campaign pack link. Pretty much every contact form plugin is going to have some sort of response page or way of responding, isn't it? So when someone enters their email on the response page, they can be linked to that resource. For example, you could use a MailChimp block and in the reply, add a link to your environmental campaign guide while you're capturing their email address at the same time. So you can see me here, I am just adding some details into the response. It's pretty crude, but they could copy that link to it. Now, that isn't a particularly secure way of doing it, but it is certainly cheap. And of course, you could use something like Yoast to ask search engines not to index the page. You can see here that I'm using the settings here to ask search engines not to index that. Hopefully then they don't. Now, if you want to do it really cheaply, you could also create your own conditional logic tree. It's probably beyond our podcaster skills or patience, but maybe you want to help them set it up. For example, I was playing with this the other day because I wanted to see what's the absolute cheapest way of doing something like this. So I created a couple of pages. You know, Are You an Elephant was my first one. Do you remember those adventure game books where you would be reading a section and, you know, if you wanted to turn right down the street, you'd go to page 40 to carry on reading. If you want to go left, you'd go to page 30 or something like that. So it's a similar sort of principle. So yes, I am an elephant. I go to page 2. No, I go to page 3. And you could add layer upon layer after that until it ends up with a contact form for that particular scenario. So page 3 has the contact form for non-elephants. So that's a really cheap way of doing it, of course, but plugins are going to save you a lot of time. So we are getting there. Gradually dealing with his objections one by one. Phil now has his podcast. His website is now capturing interest, but then he drops another bombshell. As he says, I love all this, but it's way too hard. Now, I've been studying podcasters, as I say, for the past year, and in my own research, I can see that podcasters have changed. In the old days, podcasters had to be tech savvy to get their RSS feeds to work and to get it out there. They had to connect everything up themselves. But this new wave of podcasters are different. The new wave, they just want to release podcasts, not tinker with their settings. They don't want to learn CSS and all that stuff. We all know WordPress's evolution has been a bit like a castle in medieval times. You know, you needed a turret, so you added it and so on. But just like a castle, it can be a bit of a maze if you're a newcomer to WordPress because there's so many different settings and options. And the reality is there's a lot of plugins and themes that kind of do what podcasters need already, but many are not as easy as they could be. You know, I think PowerPress has done an awesome job, but a lot, to be frank, haven't. And if you're a developer and you can redo a plugin and make it easier to use and bill it as being for podcasters, you could really tap into that market. It could be a carousel gallery, but one that just adds your podcast episodes to the front page. It could be a campaign plugin that displays what you need to launch a political campaign in a few clicks. Here's an example of targeting a niche. Sermon Manager for churches. There are a few like this. You know, is Sermon Manager really doing anything different to what other plugins do? No. But if I'm a church group and I'm thinking, how can I manage my sermons online? I'm going to be drawn to that, not to some generic plugin, because it sounds like this is going to do what I need. So there is an opportunity for developers among us to redo stuff and make it better and make it easier and to bill it as being for podcasters. It could be systems to play an audio file and then show content related to the time code it's currently at within it. It could be an easier, better way to link to people's social feeds, even tools to turn a website into a progressive web app with extra features as a podcast app. Some people still want to have their own app for their show. They also need themes and block templates at all price points. They want podcast-ready designs. So there's a lot we can do as a community to make this easier for Phil and his podcasting friends. There's also an opportunity in the private podcast space. There's an increasing number of semi-pro podcasters trying to monetize their feeds and private businesses working on podcasts for their employees. And doing this is a lot easier now. PowerPress includes that feature built in. It doesn't protect the audio file. So if you have a direct link to the file, it can't stop you downloading it and playing it. But it can stop you accessing the RSS feed, and that's the way most people listen to the episodes anyway. But these people will have their own needs. Tools to get people to consider paying for a podcast, or for a private company one, tools which entice their employees to engage and listen. So, we've helped Phil with why he needs a WordPress website. We've showed him how he can set one up. We've made sure he's hosted well, and we've showed him how to capture interest on his website. And we've helped him create a great site too. So is Phil now convinced, finally? Well, there's one other thing he might say, and that is to bring up the future of podcasting. And when you start spreading the word about podcasting, you might hear people say that it's getting harder to get noticed because the big podcasters are taking over. Well, this comes right back to the whole principle of WordPress again for me. If you look at the podcast press, as I do, in the studying that I do for my podcast, to know what people are up to, you'll see people talking about the big broadcasters coming in and taking over. You hear about them setting up podcast award ceremonies in order to pat each other on the back, which is understandable, but a bit unfair when the rest of us don't have their production time or money to compete with them. Now, it's true. They will dominate the mass market and gain great awareness for their shows. It's also true they're going to kill off some podcasts. If you want to be the next Joe Rogan, that ship has sailed. Joe Rogan is doing Joe Rogan. He's got the big marketing budget to keep it that way. And if he fails, Kim Kardashian or some other celeb will probably take over. But this is the bit they can't do. They cannot compete and will never compete with niche podcasts. And let me explain this. When I was at ITN, which as I say was the second biggest news organisation in the UK, if I went to the bosses and said, I want to make a programme on the radio that appeals to 3,000 people, they would have laughed me out of the room. It's not a big enough audience for a big organisation. Big companies need advertising revenue, and advertisers are interested in the size of your audience. And how do you get a big audience? By dumbing down, by making things very simple. It's not an insult, this, it is a commercial reality. If I asked you right now to write down what you do with WordPress in a way that both a grandma who'd never touched a computer and an 18-year-old Instagrammer could understand, you would have to write it in very simple terms, right? Otherwise, you might get one understanding but not the other. And this is why there is so much safe, forgettable content now in the media, and why there's this growing and long-term future for niche podcasting. If you can think of a niche, there's a show to be made about it. For example, if you feel your JavaScript is good, but you want to stay up with the latest developments and tools, you could listen to Modern Web. If you want to know about working in jobs with JavaScript, how about Front-End Happy? No broadcaster will ever make these shows. Do they have big loyal audiences? Yes. So niche podcasting is here to stay. There are hundreds of thousands of them already, and more podcasters are joining their ranks all the time. And after hearing all this, finally, Phil says, I like this. So we've helped him make a podcast. We've helped him turn people's enthusiasm into something that delivers results. And we've given him the tools to fulfill the reason he set up a podcast in the first place. Of course, Phil was lucky that he bumped into one of us here tonight. Sadly, many of the podcasters out there are not going to do that. They won't think about how they can really achieve their aims with their podcast. But if we can find them, then I think we can help them. You know, we have a platform that allows them to do much more than just broadcast their voice. We have a platform that allows them to turn this attention into action. If we as a community can provide the tools they need to do this in an easier way, then I think we have a hugely compelling message to get across about this. You know, the dream of WordPress was to democratize publishing, or media, call it what you like. It was about allowing people to have their own voice. Right now, many podcasters to me are whispering. With WordPress, I think we can help them shout, and shout loudly. If you would like to find out more about my research into podcasters and how they do it, my show is called Can I Make a Hit Podcast. Thank you very much for your attention, and hopefully now we can go back live and I can answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much for listening through tonight.
Like Karolína mentioned earlier, I'm Maciek Palmowski. I work at a company called Buddies, and we are developing one of the most user-friendly CI/CD out there. So if you are interested in starting in automating your flow, try using Buddy. You'll like it for sure. So let's start with a small comparison. I will show you two websites. One will be a typical WordPress site, and the second one will be the same website converted into static. And this is the sad part, because we are not in the same room and I can't see your reaction. But I hope I will imagine it right. So this is the WordPress site. It looks like this. And this is the static one. Probably you shouldn't see any difference between them. Almost any difference, because there is one difference between them. Response time. Before I continue, I am a bit cheap person in terms of paying for my hosting. The hosting I am running, WP costs me about $2 per month, and it's a really poor hosting, but it has SSH access. And as you see on this server, the average response time for WordPress is almost 3 seconds. It's a lot. After converting the same site into static, it was only 16 milliseconds. So it's an enormous difference. And if some of you thought about my presentation, okay, it's something about static, it can't be so interesting. But I think that looking at this difference, you should be a bit more interested and listen on more carefully. So first of all, let me show you what is the difference between a static website and the dynamic one. So first of all, this is a typical request for a dynamic website. So in your browser, you enter some URL, it goes to the web server. The web server parses all the files. At some points, it needs data, so it connects to the database. The database returns it to the server, and in the end, everything goes back to the browser. It's quite okay when we don't have big traffic. When our traffic becomes much bigger, it may be a big problem, because we will have two bottlenecks. First will be the server itself, the second one will be the database. That's why at some point all of us start using cache, because when we are using cache, the first time we ask for some website, it of course asks the database for data, but also it saves it as a static HTML. So next time someone asks for this website, for this page, it's served directly as a static one without any need for a database. So it's much faster. Although still there is the situation that the first time always the server and the database are asked for data. So it's much faster than the typical dynamic approach, but it still can be done better. How? By static, because with the static approach, before we even put anything on a server, we just parse, we just go through our whole website, page by page, save it as a static HTML, and when we have everything, we put it on the server. So every time a user asks for some page, he gets a static HTML. And also, the server can be a bit quicker because it doesn't need any extra layers for parsing, for databases, or anything else. And so let me start with showing you what are the main pros of converting to a static website. First of all, it's speed. This was the first thing I was talking about. And why? First of all, our server will be simpler because there is no database, there is no parsing. The server only does one thing, and this is the thing from which the name server comes from. It just serves data. That's all. And also, our server can be much easier because, like I said, it only has to do one simple thing. It doesn't need all those cool features that make PHP servers run faster. For example, if we look at, let's say, Kinsta, I really love their hosting. It's really terrific. There are, I think it's one of the fastest hostings out there, but it's quite complicated. There are many layers that make our WordPress run fast on their server, but it's so fast because of those layers and not because the server is simple. And going static can make us just have a simple server out there that will work as fast as it can. And now let me show you what are the response times, because I use Loader.io. This is a nice app for testing, and for 5 clients, every second for 30 seconds, this was this. WordPress without cache, it was almost 3-second average response. With cache, it was only 300 milliseconds, but static WordPress was 60 milliseconds. So the difference is really huge. But I decided that I will test my, like I mentioned, very cheap and very poor hosting a bit more. And I changed it to 50 clients every second for 30 seconds. So without cache, it just ended up with an 100% error rate. It just couldn't handle the traffic. With cache, the average response was 600 milliseconds, but 30% error rate. So still, it's just tragical. And with static, it was 12 milliseconds. No problem at all. It just worked. The next thing that is really great about static is the security part. First of all, because we have to build this website, we can have our WordPress on a totally separate server. So thanks to this, we can, for example, add some security layers on our WordPress server, and we don't have to worry about that they will affect the production site in any way. So, for example, we can add only a possibility that only a few IPs can log in or something like this. It's up to us. Also, and this is one of the best ways in terms of security, because WordPress can be only on our local host, especially if our website is small and we don't update it too often. We can just have it on our local computer, convert it into static, and put everything onto our server. And that's all. And like I said, this is one of the safest way, because you can't hack WordPress if you don't have access to it. So also, let's take a look at attack vectors, because even as Karolína mentioned at the beginning, during the showing us what happened in WordPress during the last 2 months, there were quite few security issues in WordPress world, and they will happen. They will always happen. These are the most typical attack vectors on WordPress. There can be some problems with core, with plugins, with themes. Someone can hack into our FTP or SFTP account. We can have a brute force attack on our WP admin. Malware problems. Someone can hack our DNS and switch the server to a different one. There can be some security issues with PHP, which we had a problem lately. And of course, there is also a possibility of denial of service attack. After converting to static, we only have few of those, and not all will be as dangerous as they were. First of all, denial of service will be much harder to execute on a static website. And if we will use, for example, Cloudflare, making a denial of service attack will be really hard to do. So, of course, it is possible, but it's much harder than doing it on a normal WordPress. And of course, someone can get our login and password for our DNS or FTP or SFTP. But as you see, none of those attack vectors is fully related with WordPress. Why? Because static, our website that will be converted from WordPress into static isn't WordPress at all, and on some configurations we won't even have PHP on our server, so it will be much more safer. Also, if you like to save few bucks, going static is also the right way, because hosting will be much cheaper. First of all, because our hosting can be much simpler. Like I mentioned, we won't even need PHP. We can use some free alternatives like GitHub Pages or Netlify to host our website, because why not? And typical WordPress hosting, when I check, for example, on Kinsta or on SiteGround, it's from about 12 to 20 euros per month per site. And like I mentioned, WP Owls and its Polish edition, the WordPressówka, are on the server, for which I pay about $2 per month, but for 2 websites. So it's much cheaper. And for me, this is one of the most important things. Static website will give you a peace of mind, because there are less things that can break. Like I mentioned, because static website is pure HTML together with CSS and JavaScript, there are just no things that can cause trouble. We don't have to worry that our database will have problems because it's not there. We don't have to worry about some problems with PHP, about some extra caching or anything else, because they are just not there. So they can't break if they are not there. Also, when we will use a CDN, for example, this Cloudflare that I mentioned before, not only our website will be equally fast all over the world, we will be protected from denial of service attack, and I had this case about 2 weeks ago. This my perfect cheap hosting just had some problems for an hour or two, but because the whole website was cached and it was already put all over the CDN, no one even noticed that the website should be down. But because everything was cached and already all the files were around the world, no one noticed it. And everything will just work. And this is the most important thing. Of course, there are some cons of converting to static because sadly there are no perfect solutions. First of all, not every site can be converted. Before I continue here, there are two things. One is static websites, and I define statics as websites that really won't need access to your source website in any way, neither by API or any other way, because that way this is the thing I just call a headless approach, and we are now talking just about the static one. So with static one, if you would need a possibility to create or have user profiles, having dynamic content that is, for example, generated based on what the user selected in its profile, or you would like to have a social media-like site where users can post their or images or some text or anything. And so in those cases, sadly, static is not the way to go. It's just impossible because static is fast and all because we just get rid of many things related to the dynamic parts of the websites. Some parts will also need to be converted a bit because, again, we get rid of PHP and database, so we need to use some third-party tools for forms, for searches, for commands, and for e-commerce. But using those, you still can have this functionality. And as you see, you can even have a static e-commerce site, and it will work. Another thing that is a bit different and maybe a bit problematic for some people is the build process itself. Because normally in WordPress, we are used to the fact that every time we click on publish or update, the result is immediately seen in public. And the build process, this is something that first of all, we have to remember about it. So every time we change a text or our website or something like this, we just have to rebuild our website in some way. It's a bit, it depends on the way, on how we convert our WordPress into static, but I will go into this a bit later. But all in all, we have to remember about it. Sometimes we can connect it with some hooks, with some API to make it more automatic. But in some cases, we will always have to remember about doing it manually. Also, it will take some extra time. Again, it will depend on the stack we will be using, but sometimes it can take some extra minutes. So we have to be prepared for it that after doing some change, we will need a few minutes to see the result. And also this can lead to one problem in some cases, because builds will take more time depending on how much posts we have. And of course, the more posts we will have, the slower the build time will be. Some of this, for example, static site generators have a possibility to use incremental builds, like Gatsby, for example. Some of them are like always fast, for example, Hugo. So it will be also very important to select the right tool for your case, because there is no one perfect solution for every situation. And now let me show you the three main ways how to convert your WordPress into static. First of all, because this is WordPress, so of course there is a plugin for this. There is a plugin called WP Static or Static HTML Output or simply Static. Next, it's great to connect it with WP CLI. Thanks to this, we will be sure that we won't have any timeout, and even if we will have a bigger website, it will convert correctly in full. And it's also a good thing, in my opinion, to connect it to some CI/CD tool, like Buddy, like GitHub Actions, like Travis or whatever. Because thanks to this, we can not only orchestrate all the actions, so not only building, but maybe we would like to do something else apart from building, for example, clearing the Cloudflare cache in the end. But also most of CI/CDs have an API access, so we can connect it to WordPress for example, make this hook that on every update, some pipeline will run automatically. And this approach can be cheap because all the plugins are free. WP CLI is free too, and almost all the CI/CDs should have a free tier. For example, I was using Buddy for free for WP Alls for a year, and it was really enough. This, for me, this is something good, that I have a full control over the whole process, because I really like to know what is happening. I really hate those situations where something magically appears out of nowhere and I don't know why and how. And so with such approach, it's all up to you. Of course, the downside of this is you have to, especially at first, spend some extra time to make this process fully working. And many plugins will be compatible out of the box, because all those plugins will just go website page after page from your WordPress and save it as HTML. So each plugin that, for example, filtered content in some way or something like this, they will work out of the box. Some plugins that were a bit more dynamic, of course, won't work because of their dynamic nature. The second approach is using the static site generator. There are like millions of them right now, and almost in any language. So we can use from most popular Gatsby for React, Gridsome for Vue, Hugo written in Go, if I remember, and Elementally. I really not quite sure in what it is written, but it's quite popular too. And together with some API, either the WP REST API or the GraphQL API. It depends which static site generator will you use. And of course, again, together with some CI/CD tool, because you can make or orchestrate it a bit better. And this approach is also cheap, because I think that most of those that static site generators are free. Those REST API is included in core, and both plugins for GraphQL API are also free. So nothing changes in terms of costs. Because there are people who don't like PHP. I really don't know why. I think it's a really nice language, but I know that there are people that don't like it. And thanks to using static site generators, they can use a different language. For example, they can play around with React or with Vue or whatever they would like. It's a bit more problematic in terms of plugins compatibility, because static site generators will need an endpoint, either for REST API or for GraphQL API. The good news is that this is changing. This is really changing, and I see that most major plugins are really trying to give out of the box at least REST API endpoint, and there are a lot of extra plugins that give a bridge for GraphQL. So, but I still think that in about a year or two, all the big plugins will have integrated both GraphQL and REST API inside of there. And there is a third way to go. It's using a service like Static, like Shifter or Flat Sites. The bad news, this is more expensive. From what I remember, Static is from about $20 per month per website. We don't have no control over the process, which makes me a bit mad because, like I mentioned, I really have to know what is happening under the hood. But the good news is it works. It really works. I played around with Static a bit, and I was quite amazed that after 15 minutes everything was just working. I still don't know how, but it was working. So that's good news. And some of those services has some plugin integrations out of the box. Static, from what I know, have an integration with for search, for forms, and they're adding some more. And so if you would be interested about some integrations, remember to first check out which service can give you which integrations, because it may save you a lot of time. So is it worth it converting into static? So I think that most people here are from IT, so you probably know the answer. That depends. Of course, that depends. I would say that if your website doesn't have any login and registration, it's like a website for reading, so it's a blog, a business page, a portfolio, and it's not focused on adding a new post every few seconds, because then the build process would just kill you. Really go for it. Go for it. It will you will have less trouble, less things to worry about, and by the way, there is a chance you will save a few dollars as well. And let me show you a real life example. This WP OWLs that even Karolina mentioned, thank you. And the server structure here is, like I said, you can have it on 2 servers, but I was a bit lazy and I just used 1 server. But it has an SSH access, so this was the most important thing to me, because thanks to SSH, I already had access to WP CLI, so I could build everything in the background. WordPress is under a subdomain, and the static version is under the top-level domain. And also, I am using Cloudflare, thanks to which visitors from all over the world can view my website, even that is hosted in somewhere in the middle of Poland. I'm using static HTML output, so I'm just exporting everything as a zip. I'm excluding URLs I don't need. This is quite an important thing, to exclude things you won't need. It can really make the build process much faster. And in the end, I just run my CI/CD. So first, as you see, the static HTML runs. Then there goes the server operation. So I just copy everything from WP content uploads. Just to be sure, every time I'm fixing the htaccess, to be sure that the website is crawlable. And in the end, I am clearing the Cloudflare cache. And using HTML output, the build time for about 30 pages is 2 or 3 minutes, for 200 pages 4 or 5. But I was playing around with converting into WP to static, and I was able to convert those 200 pages in about less than 2 minutes. So like I mentioned, this is why the control over the process matters, because you can tinker with it, you can change it, and you can make it much better. And if you would like to learn a bit more about how to convert WordPress into a static, visit Bodyworks, and there is a guide about how to do it. Okay, so that's all. Are there any questions?
Thank you. Great presentation. First, could you please share the link to your body, how to spin it up?
I will share the link to my presentation.
Oh, that's maybe better.
And of course this will be okay. I shared it already.
Yeah, great. So there are two options. Either somebody have a really good question which should be recorded finally because the recording works, or all of us, I mean we're like 20, could move to sessions and you could ask your questions directly to Maciek or Rick, which I think it could be more like live experience, or at least I really liked that feature when we were in WordCamp Prague. So if there's no question, I would thank you both that you accepted my invitation and you shared your knowledge with us. And we'll shut down the stage and move to sessions where we can discuss things more or less lively. So sessions on the left side where the member icon or whatever it is, just click to Q&A and there should be a table where you can either post into comments or you can join us with a webcam and a mic and ask in person. Is it all right, Rick, Maciek?
Of course.
Yeah, we can't hear you, but never mind. We're switching anyway. Yeah. So see you there and thanks for coming.